Nobody in the entire building dared to look Richard Calloway in the eyes. Not the executives. Not the assistants. Not even the board members who had known him for 20 years. The billionaire CEO of Callaway Dynamics was known across Manhattan as the coldest man in corporate America. People whispered when he walked past. Meetings went silent the moment he entered a room. Employees vanished from their desks without warning after making even the smallest mistake. But while everyone in that glass tower feared him, someone inside the building had been quietly stealing millions of dollars right under his nose. And the only person brave enough to walk into his office and tell him the truth was the old janitor that nobody ever bothered to notice. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Calloway was worth over $4 billion. At 48 years old, he ran one of the most powerful investment firms in New York, with offices stretching across the top 3 floors of a glass skyscraper overlooking Central Park. The floors were Italian marble. The elevators had gold trim. There was a private chef on the executive level and conference rooms with walls made entirely of glass, so Richard could see everyone, and everyone could see him. From the outside, the company looked flawless. Forbes had written about it. Investors lined up for meetings. But inside those glass walls, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. Richard ran his company through fear. He had built it that way on purpose. He genuinely believed that kindness made people lazy, and that fear made people sharp. So employees stopped speaking up in meetings. Managers learned to hide bad news until it became impossible to hide. Executives told him what he wanted to hear, not what was actually happening. Nobody wanted to be the next person Richard fired in front of the whole floor because he had done it before more than once and people still talked about it years later. Over time, that fear became something far more dangerous than any bad quarter ever could be. It became a wall, and behind that wall, nobody was watching anymore. On the night shift, in the basement locker room nobody on the executive floor had ever seen, worked a 62-year-old janitor named Walter Hayes. Most employees didn't know his name. Some didn't know he existed at all. He came in after the offices emptied out, pushed his cart down the long marble hallways, vacuumed under desks, wiped fingerprints off the glass conference room walls, and emptied the trash cans full of coffee cups and crumpled up memos. Walter had worked there for 8 years. He was quiet, polite, and easy to overlook, which was exactly why he saw and heard things that nobody else ever did. Have you ever worked somewhere and felt completely invisible, like the people around you didn't even register you were in the room? That's what it was like for Walter every single night. But unlike everyone else in that building, Walter actually listened. He noticed the small things. The way 2 executives would stop talking the second he walked by with his cart. The way certain offices had their lights on long after midnight, with the blinds pulled down tight. The way the shredder on the 42nd floor ran constantly some weeks, and not at all other weeks. For a long time, Walter told himself it wasn't his business. He had a routine, a paycheck, and a quiet life. But quiet doesn't mean blind. One night in late October, Walter was cleaning the executive floor a little earlier than usual because a water pipe had burst on the floor below. As he pushed his cart past a conference room, the door was open just a few inches, and the lights inside were still on. 2 senior executives, men whose names were on the company directory in gold letters, were standing over a laptop, talking in low, tense voices. Walter slowed down without meaning to. One of them said something that made him stop completely. By the time Richard figures it out, we'll already be gone. Walter stood frozen in the hallway, his cart wheel squeaking softly against the marble. Through the small gap in the door, Walter could see spreadsheets on the screen. Numbers with too many zeros. Company names he had never heard of before. Names that sounded official but somehow felt wrong. One of the executives pointed at a column and said, "As long as it routes through the Delaware account first, nobody on the audit side will ever connect it back to us." The other one laughed quietly and said, "Richard doesn't even read his own financial summaries anymore. He just signs what's put in front of him." Walter backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. and finished his shift in silence that night, barely able to focus on his work. For the next few weeks, Walter started noticing things he had ignored for years. Documents left behind in conference rooms with numbers crossed out and rewritten. Empty folders in the recycling bin that were labeled with client names he recognized from the lobby directory. Late-night visitors who came in through the parking garage instead of the main entrance, so the security desk wouldn't log them. None of it proved anything on its own. But together, it painted a picture of money slowly disappearing from a company that everyone on the outside believed was untouchable. If you were in Walter's position, knowing something was deeply wrong but having no real proof and no power to do anything about it, what would you have done? Walter asked himself that question every night on his way home. He thought about staying quiet. He was 62 years old, 2 years from retirement, with a modest apartment in Queens and a daughter who was finishing nursing school. He couldn't afford to lose this job over something that wasn't even his department. But every night, the same thought kept him awake. If this kept going and the company collapsed, hundreds of people would lose their jobs, not just the executives in the corner offices. Walter started writing things down. Dates, times, what he saw and heard. Exactly as it happened, nothing exaggerated. He kept a small notebook in his jacket pocket, the kind you'd buy for $1 at a drugstore, and at the end of each shift he'd sit in the break room and write a few lines before going home. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He told himself he was just keeping a record, in case anyone ever asked. But deep down, he already knew that someday, somebody would have to say something out loud, and it might have to be him. If you're finding yourself invested in Walter's story so far, do us a favor and hit that like button. It really helps this video reach more people. And if you haven't already, now's a good time to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 6 weeks after that first night in the hallway, on a rainy Tuesday evening in early December, Walter made a decision that changed everything. He had just finished his rounds on the 38th floor when he saw the private elevator doors open on the executive level. The one that went straight to Richard Calloway's office and required a special key card most employees never even saw. Walter stood there for a long moment, his cart beside him, rain still dripping off his jacket from the walk-in earlier that evening. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his notebook, and pressed the button for the top floor. No janitor had ever done that before. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, the receptionist, a young woman named Claire who usually left by 6, was still at her desk finishing paperwork. She looked up, confused, then alarmed. "Sir, you can't be up here. This elevator is for executives only." Walter stepped out slowly, his notebook held against his chest like it might fall apart if he let go of it. He kept his voice steady, even though his hands were shaking. "I need to speak with Mr. Calloway. It's about the company. If nobody tells him tonight, there won't be a company left to clean." Claire hesitated, glancing toward the glass doors of Richard's office, where the lights were still on even though it was almost 8 in the evening. Richard was inside, finishing a call with 2 board members, both of whom happened to be the same men Walter had overheard 6 weeks earlier. Claire could have turned Walter away. It would have been the easier choice, the safer choice for her own job. But something in the old man's face, the way he wasn't asking for anything for himself, made her pick up the phone instead. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly, "there's someone here who says it's urgent. It's about the company." The doors to Richard's office opened, and the moment he saw Walter standing there in his gray work uniform, holding a small notebook, Richard's face twisted with disbelief and anger. "A janitor interrupted my meeting?" he said, loud enough for the 2 executives still on the video call to hear. The room went silent. One of the executives on the screen actually let out a short, nervous laugh, the kind of laugh people give when they're trying to seem unbothered. Walter didn't move. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice came out steady. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your executives are stealing from you." For a moment, nobody in that office said a word. Richard stood frozen behind his desk, staring at Walter like he had spoken a different language. The 2 executives on the video screen went pale, one of them quickly muting his microphone, though it was already too late because Richard had already turned to look at the screen, then back at Walter. "How do you know that?" Richard asked, his voice lower now, almost careful. And that's when Walter opened his notebook and began to read, slowly, every date, every overheard conversation, every strange folder, every late-night visitor who came in through the parking garage. Walter told him about the conference room conversation in October, the spreadsheet with the Delaware account, the line about Richard not reading his own financial summaries. He told him about the shredder running late at night on weeks when nothing should have needed shredding. He told him about 3 specific dates when documents with client names had ended up in the recycling bin, torn but not destroyed completely, and how he had quietly kept a few of them, just in case. As Walter spoke, Richard sat down slowly in his chair, something nobody in that office had ever seen him do during a confrontation. He always stood. Tonight he sat. By the time Walter finished, it was almost 9 in the evening, and Richard hadn't said a single word for several minutes. He picked up his phone and called his head of internal security, then his lawyer, then the chairman of the board, all within about 10 minutes. Within an hour, IT had locked the accounts of both executives on that earlier video call. By midnight, federal investigators had been quietly notified, because the amounts involved were large enough that this wasn't just a company matter anymore. Walter stayed in the lobby that whole time, sitting on a bench near the elevators, because nobody had told him he could go home, and he didn't want to leave in case they needed him again. Before we get to what happened next, if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the way this ends is something a lot of people say they didn't expect. Over the next few days, the investigation moved faster than anyone expected. It turned out 3 senior executives, not just 2, had been involved in a scheme that funneled money through shell companies and fake consulting contracts for almost 4 years. The total came to just over $11 million. When the news broke, business channels ran the story for days, calling it one of the more brazen internal fraud cases they'd covered in years. But the detail that caught everyone's attention wasn't the dollar amount. It was the fact that the person who uncovered it wasn't an auditor, wasn't a board member, and wasn't even part of the finance department at all. Have you ever wondered how many problems in a workplace, or even in a family, go unspoken simply because the people who notice them feel like nobody would believe them anyway? That question is exactly what Richard found himself sitting with in the days after the arrests. He kept thinking about how long this had been happening, right under his roof, while he sat in his glass office on the top floor, completely unaware. And he kept coming back to one uncomfortable truth. It wasn't that nobody noticed. People had noticed. They just didn't trust him enough to say anything. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the company. News outlets picked it up not just for the fraud itself, but for the way it had been uncovered. People online debated whether $10 million was too much or not enough for what Walter had risked. But what most people remembered weeks later wasn't the dollar amount, and it wasn't even the arrests. It was a short clip from that lobby announcement, the most feared billionaire in Manhattan, shaking the hand of a 62-year-old janitor he had screamed at just days earlier, both of them standing there a little awkwardly, neither one quite sure what to say. Walter eventually moved into his new role, though he kept things simple. He didn't take a corner office. He asked for a desk near the lobby instead, close to the front doors, where people came in every morning. He said it was the only place in the building where he could actually talk to people. Richard, for his part, didn't become a different person overnight. Old habits don't disappear in a week, but people noticed small changes. He started asking questions in meetings instead of just reacting. He stopped firing people on the spot. And more than once, when something difficult needed to be said, employees found themselves walking, almost without thinking about it, toward the desk near the lobby doors. So here's something worth sitting with for a moment. How many people walk past you every single day without you really seeing them the way Walter was seen, or rather wasn't seen for 8 years? And if you were in Walter's position, knowing something was wrong but having every reason to stay quiet, do you think you would have said something? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your place? Let us know in the comments what you think, and whether you believe Richard's reaction to all of this felt earned, or if it came too late for the people who had been afraid of him for years. Because sometimes the people with the lowest titles see the highest truths. And sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one brave enough to save everyone else in it. If this story moved you, give it a like, drop a comment telling us what part stuck with you the most, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that being kind to people costs nothing. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we post stories like this every single week, and you won't want to miss the next one.